Okay, let's take a look at some other problems that we might need to deal with by using asynchronous messages. And another issue that we might have is that when we get the message in our consumer and we attempt to save it to the database, that might fail and we might have an exception. And because that could possibly be a transient type of error where the database may come back online, that might be something that we want to retry several times before giving up and genuinely throwing the toys out of the pram and causing an exception. So let's go and just see what happens first of all if we stop our MongoDB. And we've got the service bus up, we've got Postgres up, and if we go and attempt to create a new auction, and let's just check the logs for the search service before we go ahead and do this. So the search service logs, I'll click on this, and everything seems okay at the moment. But if we attempt to create a new auction, which is going to cause that message to hit the service bus and then be consumed by the search service, let's click send. The auction is created, of course, because that's being created in our auction service. But if we go check the search service, then what we get is the consuming auction created. But this should time out, and it probably will take about 30 seconds in total for this to give up and throw the exception. So I'll just pause the video. It's probably going to take a few more seconds for that to come up. And sure enough, here we go. We see the exception to tell us that the database is down. Now, if I start the database and restart MongoDB, this is a situation where we will not have that new auction created in our database because the message has been consumed. The service bus has done its job, but the message has now been disposed of because we have consumed it from the search service. So if I try and get the new auction that was just created, then what we'll see is that this does not exist in our database. So what we can do is, on a per endpoint basis, if we wish, we can configure retry policies. So let's go take a look. And inside the program class for the search service, then we can configure inside RabbitMQ some retry policies for specific endpoints. Now, we've got this configure endpoints, which is just going to configure all the endpoints based on the consumers that we have, based on this line here. But if we want to configure on a per endpoint basis, we can also do that. So inside the RabbitMQ configuration, I'm just going to say configure and receive endpoint. And we need to specify the name of our endpoint here, which is going to be search-auction-created. And then we can say E for the endpoint formatter and say e.useMessageRetry and say R goes to r.interval, and then we can specify 5 for the number of retries and another number for the time in between the retries, and that's the time span of each second. So effectively, we're going to try it 5 times and wait for 5 seconds between each interval. And we also need to specify which consumer we're configuring this for. So I'm going to say e configure consumer, and this is going to be for auction created. So it's only going to apply, or auction created consumer. And I need to pass this the context. So this is only going to apply for the auction created consumer for this particular configuration. So I'm just going to restart the search service. In fact, let's make sure MongoDB is up and running as well, and it is. So the service should start successfully. And it does. And if I go back and stop MongoDB again, and let's retry that request to create a new auction, which should succeed without any problems. But of course, if I try and get this, then that's not going to work because we don't have our MongoDB, so that request isn't even going to go through. And if we take a look at the search service, what we should see is that we're attempting to consume this. And we should eventually see the exception that says, yep, we can't do this. But what we should find is that if we restart the MongoDB and we go back and take a look at our logs, and we'll need to wait for the retry to take effect, which may have already happened whilst I was messing around between windows. So let's just see if we can get that new auction now. And sure, I didn't see it in the logs. I was looking for the auction consumed, but what we have now is the retry kicked in, it did work, and we can see that the new auction we created is now accessible in our search database. And there's one more thing I want to talk about and demonstrate before we move on, is if we take a look at RabbitMQ, then we can see that we've got some additional exchanges and an additional queue where our error gets sent to, because we are not dealing with the faults in mass transit at the moment. We just simply used a retry. But these queues were created when we have an exception from our consumer that we didn't deal with, then that exception gets put into this queue. And if I go and take a look at search auction created and go into the queue itself and then take a look at the messages and get the message, then what we should see inside here is the exception that was generated when MongoDB was down, and that gets put inside this queue. So we can also consume fault messages as well and do something with them. And what we'll take a look at next is specifically how we deal with that. And if there's an exception we can do something about that we know could possibly be generated, then we can take an action on that exception, and we'll take a look at that next.